Lost Islamic History audiobook by Firas-Alkhateeb, Chapter 7. Landless. In the story of Islam and the Muslim people, attention is usually focused on the core region of the Muslim world, stretching from the Nile to the Oxus rivers, including Egypt, Syria, the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq and Persia. However, it is also important to contextualize Islamic history in the region where Muslim civilization directly bordered the rest of the world. In the Iberian Peninsula, home today to Spain and Portugal, Islam interacted directly with Christian Europe. A complex and diverse society developed here that was both Muslim and Western European. Establishment of Islam in Spain. After the rapid conquest of North Africa in the mid-7th century by the Umayyads, Muslim conquest slowed for a time. The Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean Sea seemed a natural border to the new Muslim empire, and the late 600s were dedicated to consolidating the conquered land and incorporating its people into the Muslim world. But the floodgates of conquest opened again in the 710s when Muslim armies began to pour into the Iberian Peninsula, adding yet another distant land to the Muslim domain. The reasons for the rapid conquest of the peninsula have long been debated. To the people who witnessed the campaign, on both sides, it was simply a manifestation of God's pleasure or displeasure. For the Muslims, the conquest was so fast and easy simply because God had willed that this land would enter into the Muslim empire. For the Christians, they explained their massive loss by claiming that God was upset with the immoral behavior of the Visigoths and thus he sent the Muslim invaders as punishment. There are of course more concrete factors to understand. Firstly, the unpopularity of Roderick and the Visigothic monarchy due to pre-existing political conflicts. Some aristocrats failed to support the king in the face of invasion from Africa, and during the Battle of Guadalete, desertion by soldiers and nobles helped turn the tide. The fact that the Visigoths were unpopular is evidenced by the fact that after the climactic battle, few cities put up any resistance to the Muslim invaders. In fact, the main resistance was seen in the northern mountains and was not led by the Visigoths, but by political separatists fighting for independence before the Muslim invasion. The main cities of the Visigothic realm quickly capitulated to the Muslims who promised favorable surrender terms and local autonomy. The relative freedom granted by the Muslims to the general population must have contrasted sharply with an unpopular Visigothic regime. After the quick conquest was over, the settlement of the land by Muslims began. Unlike the settlement pattern in parts of the Middle East, where armies settled in garrison towns organized by the Rashidun and Umayyad authorities, in a landless settlement was mostly unorganized and haphazard. The Muslims did not confine themselves to garrison towns, choosing instead to become property owners throughout the peninsula. The Berber immigrants tended to settle in the north and west, seeking pastoral environments similar to what they were used to in North Africa. The Arab tribes that came to Al-Andalus were mostly from Yemen and had a long history of settled farming. As a result, they settled mainly in the fertile regions of the south and the country's main cities such as Cordoba, Valencia and Jargoja. Both Arabs and Berbers regularly intermarried with the local population, eventually creating a new unique society that incorporated aspects of Arab, Berber and Hispanic culture. Umayyad rule. For the first few decades of Muslim rule, Al-Andalus was little more than a distant and uneventful province of the vast Umayyad Caliphate. That changed in the 750s when the Abbasids succeeded in overthrowing the Umayyad family. In Syria, most members of the Umayyad family were jailed or executed. One young Umayyad managed to escape the carnage, however. Abd al-Rahman, a 20-year-old prince, escaped from Damascus in 750 just ahead of the Abbasid army, and began an epic journey across the Muslim world in search of help and support after the rest of his family had perished. His mother was a Berber, so he naturally sought aid in the Berber homeland in North Africa. Always just one step ahead of the pursuing Abbasid agents, he finally found support for the Umayyad family in Al-Andalus in 755. Here, he established himself as the ruler of an Umayyad state, with Cordoba as its capital, politically separate from the Abbasids based in faraway Baghdad. His journey from Syria to this distant western land gave him the nickname Al-Dakhil, the immigrant. The Umayyad Emirate established by Abd al-Rahman al-Dakhil became a cultural melting pot during the centuries after his rule. People from the rest of the Muslim world continued to immigrate to this distant land, carrying with them aspects of their home cultures. In addition to that, a large portion of the native Hispanic population converted to Islam in the late 800s and early 900s. By 950, about half of the peninsula's population was likely Muslim, and by the 1100s Christians would make up only about 20% of the population. Arab, Berber and Hispanic Muslims combined to create a unique Andalusian culture that brought together diverse backgrounds and traditions under the banner of Islam. Even Christians living in Al-Andalus adopted Islamic culture and began adopting Arabic language, art and customs. This influence culture and language is still seen today in the Spanish language, which retains many loanwords from Arabic. Jews also benefited greatly from Andalusian society. Throughout the rest of Europe, Jews were barely tolerated in the Middle Ages, and pogroms against them were a constant threat. In Muslim Spain, however, Jews were given the freedom to practice their religion as they pleased and became integral parts of society. Jewish philosophy reached its zenith in Muslim Spain, producing scholars such as Maimonides, who is known to this day as one of the greatest Jewish philosophers of all time. The Great Mosque of Cordoba was built over a 200-year period in the Umayyad capital. It exhibits 856 columns, many of which originally came from older Roman ruins. The peak of the Umayyad state in Spain occurred during the reign of Abd al-Rahman III, from 912 to 961. During his almost half-century in power, he declared himself as Caliph of the Muslim world. Although he did not have any power outside of the Iberian Peninsula. His claim to the role his Umayyad ancestors held in the 7th and 8th centuries was meant to combat the growing power of the Fatimids in North Africa. The Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad were by now ineffectual prisoners in their own palaces under the command of various Turkic dynasties, and the Shia Fatimids were a real threat to the continued existence of Sunni Islam as a political force. Abd al-Rahman III was a true patron of the arts and sciences, on the same level as the earlier Abbasid al-Mamun and the later Ottoman Suleiman the Magnificent. Over 600 libraries dotted Cordoba, the capital. Its largest library boasted a collection of over 400,000 books in a multitude of languages. Shops were numerous in the city, producing goods that were valued throughout Europe. Leather, silk, paper, wool and crystal were all produced in Cordoba and traded throughout Europe as well as the Muslim world. It was a world-class city that served as a bridge between undeveloped, generally illiterate Europe and the great cultured cities of the Muslim world. If a European wanted to be well-educated, they would travel to Al-Andalus to be in the presence of its great scholars and libraries. Even a 10th century leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Sylvester II, studied in Al-Andalus in his youth, and was mesmerized by the scientific achievements of Muslim civilization. In later centuries, when the first universities opened up in Italy, France and England, much of their libraries were made up of Latin translations of the works in Cordoba's library. Muslim Spain was the main thoroughfare through which the accumulated knowledge of the Muslim world made its way into Europe, helping spark the Renaissance in the 1400s. Cordoba's magnificence was not limited to its knowledge. Abd al-Rahman and earlier rulers of Al-Andalus emphasized their power and wealth through elaborate and beautiful mosques and palaces, the best example being the Grand Mosque of Cordoba. Originally built by Abd al-Rahman al-Dakhil, it was expanded numerous times in the 800s and 900s, eventually becoming a vast building capable of holding thousands of worshippers. Its trademark forest of columns topped by 2 levels of arches made of alternating red and white stone made it an architectural marvel that was rivaled in Europe only by the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Unlike the paintings and statues that abound in Christian churches, calligraphy and geometric design were the main form of artistic impression throughout the building. Verses from the Quran written in the angular Gothic script of Arabic calligraphy wrapped around the walls of the mosque, invoking the Islamic belief that the Quran was the highest form of literary expression and thus deserved to be in Islam's most beautiful mosques. Architectural achievements also occurred in the secular realm when Abd al-Rahman III built a giant palace city outside of Cordoba. Madinat al-Jahra, the beautiful city, was the Versailles of its time, captivating visitors from distant states who came on diplomatic missions to a landless capital. All this contributed to Cordoba's nickname throughout the rest of Europe, the ornament of the world. Unfortunately for the people of Al-Andalus, however, the beauty and emphasis on knowledge in Al-Andalus had some negative consequences. The early enthusiasm for warfare that was seen in the rapid conquest of the peninsula and invasions into Frankish territory subsided as citizens began to live more comfortable lifestyles. The Cordoban rulers had trouble rallying men from the cities and the countryside to join imperial armies destined to battle the Christian kingdoms of the north. The Andalusians were content, complacent, and unwilling to leave the comfort of their lives for the defense of Muslim Spain. The lethargy of the population crept into the upper echelons of power. By the early 11th century, the battle for control among members of the Umayyad family and their supporters was common. Rather than focus on external enemies, the elites aimed their efforts at eliminating rival factions within Cordoba. Groups competing for power were all too eager to enlist Christians from the north and Berbers from Africa to support their causes. In 1009, Suleiman II overthrew another member of the Umayyad clan with an army composed almost entirely of Castilians and Berbers by attacking Cordoba and declaring himself caliph. This led to a reprisal attack on Cordoba the next year by another faction and a reprisal attack for the reprisal attack by Suleiman's supporters the year after that. The tolerant and stable society of 10th century Cordoba was quickly sinking under the mud of power struggles and civil war. Throughout the 1010s and 1020s, Al-Andalus political unity dissolved into numerous competing states, with each state known as a Tafa. The Tafa period and Berber reformers. The Tafa period of Al-Andalus lasted for the majority of the 11th century. The word Tafa, plural Tawaif, itself comes from the Quran, which exhorts Muslims to make peace between two competing Tawaif, or factions, that come to blows. Yet peace was a rare luxury during this period. Ethnic rivalries between Arab, Berber, and Iberian Muslims became a focus of conflict as petty kings throughout the peninsula competed to replace the fallen Umayyads. Cities that had once been important pieces of the Umayyad state such as Cordoba, Seville, Toledo, Granada and Jargoja devolved into small, independent kingdoms constantly at war. Once prosperous Al-Andalus quickly fell into ruin as decades of war ravaged the country. Contemporaries such as Bin Hazm, a jurist, historian and philosopher, mourned the destruction of country estates and quiet villages by competing armies. If Muslim Tafa kings fought to gain power over Al-Andalus, the result was regrettably ironic for Islam in Iberia. The only victors of the Tafa period were the Christian states of the north. Since the original conquest of Iberia in the early 700s, the northernmost reaches of the peninsula eluded Muslim control. Small Christian states were established there in the aftermath of the conquest, protected by the mountainous terrain. They were easily kept at bay when Al-Andalus was one united political entity, but when it fractured into competing states, the Christian kings took advantage. Numerous Tafa kings enlisted the help of Christian armies in their conflicts against fellow Muslims. Such actions would have scandalized the early Muslim community and pious contemporaries, but for the Tafa kings, power and control were most important, regardless of ideology. By interfering in inter-Muslim warfare, Christian states such as Castile, Leon and Navarre managed to expand their own wealth and territory at the expense of the Muslims. In one example, the Tafa of Toledo paid an enormous sum to the Kingdom of Navarre to invade Jargoja, which in turn paid Castile to raid the Toledo countryside, depopulating it and seizing much of its wealth. Muslims paid Christians to attack and weaken other Muslims in this dark chapter of Al-Andalus history. The result was the loss of huge tracts of land throughout the peninsula and the military and economic growth of Spain's Christian states. The fall of Toledo in 1085 to Castile was an important symbolic and strategic loss. Located right in the center of Iberia, its fall meant that Christian power could now directly threaten any of the Tafa states, even in the far south. It was only at this point that the Tafa kings realized they could not hold out against the Christian kings for long and began to look to the rest of the Muslim world for help. That help came in the form of a Puritan movement from Africa known as the Murabitun. The Murabitun movement was founded in the desert landscape of Morocco, along the trade routes that linked North Africa with the wealthy kingdoms of West Africa. The people there were Berbers who had converted to Islam during the centuries after the Muslim conquest of North Africa in the 600s. By the 11th century, almost all the Berber tribes were Muslim in name, but many held on to pre-Islamic beliefs and practices. The pre-Islamic tribal alliances were particularly strong and not unlike the pre-Islamic Arab tribal rivalries of the Arabian Peninsula. One Berber theologian, Abdullah bin Yasin, sought to bring Berber society more in line with traditional Islam in the mid-11th century. He named his movement the Murabitun, meaning those who hold fast, alluding to a verse from the Quran requiring that Muslims hold fast to the path of Allah. Spanish and English corrupted the name into the Almoravid dynasty, the name by which they are most known today. The movement was simple in essence, which added to its popularity. Bin Yasin declared that the Murabitun have three main goals: promoting righteousness, forbidding injustice, and eliminating un-Islamic taxes. And if two factions among the believers should fight, then make settlement between the two. But if one of them oppresses the other, then fight against the one that oppresses until it returns to the ordinance of Allah. The Murabitun movement grew exponentially throughout the 11th century and not by conquest. The basic message and simple lifestyle of the Murabitun was attractive to the Berber tribes. It recalled the simplicity and straightforwardness of the Prophet Muhammad's original message. Similar to how many Arabs voluntarily accepted Islam in 7th century Arabia, many Berber tribes voluntarily joined the Murabitun Confederation. By the 1180s, as the movement extended from North Africa to the wealthy territories of Ghana in West Africa. Its rapid growth out of the Sahara Desert meant it was fundamentally different from Muslim Spain. Whereas settled Muslim civilization had existed in a landless for hundreds of years, the Murabitun were untainted by the wealth and luxuries of city life. The Berber warriors were tough and ready to fight, a quality that did not go unnoticed by the petty Tafa kings of Al-Andalus. When the Christian Reconquista threatened the existence of Muslim Spain, the Tafa kings called on the Murabitun for help. Led by Alfonso VI of Castile in the late 1000s, as the Reconquista reached the walls of Seville, a major center of political Islam in Spain. Thus, the Tafa king of Seville, along with some of the other quarreling Muslim leaders in Iberia, sent for the Murabitun in the name of Muslim unity against a common Christian enemy. In 1086, the Murabitun, led by Yusuf bin Tashfin, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with 12,000 soldiers. Bin Ziyad crossed the same strait to bring Iberia under Muslim control 375 years earlier. Now, bin Tashfin was doing the same to ensure it remained so, but he made it clear this was not a campaign of conquest. Bin Tashfin was coming at the request of the existing kings of Al-Andalus and seems to have had no interest in annexing the region to the Murabitun Empire. Thus, his army met up with the army of Seville and clashed with Alfonso at the Battle of Zalaca in October of 1086 near Burgos. The result was a decisive victory over the Castilians. Alfonso was forced to retreat from his advance on Muslim lands, and for the time being, what remained of Muslim Spain was safe. Although bin Tashfin had the upper hand, he chose not to follow up his victory with a campaign of conquest in the peninsula. Instead, he retreated with the majority of his army back to North Africa, where the political complexities of Al-Andalus Tafa were absent. Despite being a foreign minority ruling over Al-Andalus, the Murabitun were well accepted early in their reign. Their reliance on local scholars of Islam as government officials and lower tax rates led to widespread support from the general population. The Murabitun could not stay out of the politics and conflicts to the north. Yusuf bin Tashfin was called back to Al-Andalus in 1088 to aid in another campaign against Alfonso. Ostensibly, this was to be a unified Muslim force bringing together various Tafas and the Murabitun. But bin Tashfin's experience on this expedition was less than uplifting. The campaign was constantly hampered by rivalries among the Tafa kings, who regularly complained to bin Tashfin about each other and distrusted anyone but their closest supporters. The campaign resulted in failure, and bin Tashfin returned a second time to Africa, determined not to get involved in Andalusian politics again. The inherent weakness of Tafa Al-Andalus and the rivalries of the kings meant that Alfonso VI would once again become a threat to the continuation of Islam in Iberia, and yet again bin Tashfin and the Murabitun were called on to save the day. Upon his third entrance into Al-Andalus, bin Tashfin came armed with a fatwa from none other than Imam al-Ghazali, declaring that the Tafa kings were corrupt, unfit to rule and should be removed from power. In 1090, the Murabitun conquest of Al-Andalus commenced, with bin Tashfin personally leading the campaign to end the Tafa period. The petty Tafa kings were not willing to give up their realms to the Berbers, and some even pledged allegiance to Christian kingdoms in order to resist the Murabitun. Such actions only confirmed the suspicions of the Andalusians and the Islamic scholars that the Tafa kings were concerned only with themselves and their power, and not with the defense of the Muslim world. Popular uprisings in support of the Murabitun erupted throughout Al-Andalus, led by scholars who demanded the return of past glory. Yusuf bin Tashfin's takeover of the Muslim territories of Al-Andalus thus ended up being relatively bloodless. As Tafa kings were overthrown, they were exiled one by one to North Africa, where their petty disputes could no longer cause division in Al-Andalus. Within 10 years, all the Tafa states had capitulated to the Murabitun, with the exception of Zaragoza. But even its king was wise enough to acknowledge the superiority of the Berbers and signed an alliance with them. Yusuf bin Tashfin, with an empire that stretched 3,000 kilometers from Al-Andalus to Ghana, was one of the most powerful people in the world at the end of the 11th century. The Andalusian acceptance of Murabitun control over Al-Andalus may initially seem surprising. Nomadic Berber warriors, with a strict interpretation of Islam conquering and annexing an almost 400-year-old established and settled civilization, would normally be resisted. But here one of the unique repeating themes of Islamic history is seen. When a part of the Muslim world is politically fractured, and external invasion is imminent, rallying around one leader under the banner of Muslim unity is usually the only path to safety. The example of this far western outpost of Islam was repeated in the unity of Egypt and Syria under Salah al-Din during the Crusades and the absorption of the Turkish Beyliks in the 1300s by the Ottomans. For the Andalusians, Berber Muslim rulers, with their foreign culture, language, and ideas were more tolerable than the encroachment of the Spanish Christians, who seemed determined to stamp out Islam itself in the Iberian Peninsula. Added to this, the simple message of the Murabitun, of getting back to pure Islam as it was intended to be practiced, and removing unfair laws and taxes, was certainly attractive to the Andalusians. Despite their popularity and success in Al-Andalus, the Murabitun were not immune to the natural rise and fall of dynasties. Under Yusuf bin Tashfin, they had expanded greatly to absorb most of the Muslim lands of Iberia into an intercontinental empire, but they failed to regain territory previously lost to the Christians. Toledo, the once great Muslim city, was gone forever, and the Christian kingdoms were only halted, not destroyed. Bin Tashfin's son, Ali, from 1106 to 1143, lacked the desert upbringing of his father, and although he seems to have been a well-intentioned leader, he did not have the ability to expand the empire through warfare that his father had. When the Murabitun first entered Al-Andalus at the end of the 11th century, their popularity stemmed from the fact that they were capable of finally defeating the encroaching Christian armies. As the military might of the Murabitun declined and Christians began to score major victories against the Muslims once again in the 12th century, their purpose in Al-Andalus was called into question. Rebellion even broke out in Cordoba, the old Umayyad capital, where the people were fed up with the inaccessible and foreign Murabitun who ruled the city. But the actual fall of the Murabitun would come from North Africa, where they got started. Another Berber Muslim religious movement began to grow in the Atlas Mountains that towered over the Murabitun capital of Marrakesh. They called themselves the Muwahidun, meaning the monotheists. The leader of this new movement, bin Thumart, preached that the Murabitun had strayed from the correct practice of Islam and that the luxuries of Al-Andalus had corrupted them and made them complacent. The Muwahidun movement also took a very strong theological stance, arguing that religious innovations were rampant throughout Al-Andalus and North Africa. Berber tribes that had previously supported the Murabitun switched allegiances and joined with the new Muwahidun movement throughout the 1120s and 1130s. In 1147, they were powerful enough to challenge the Murabitun in the open, descending from the mountains to successfully attack Marrakesh. Within a year, all of Morocco had succumbed to the Muwahidun. The preoccupation of the Murabitun with the growing Muwahidun movement in Africa led to Al-Andalus being neglected militarily by the Murabitun. That, coupled with the popular discontent of the Andalusian population, led to the emergence of a second Tafa period, starting in 1144. Once again, rival factions arose in the Iberian Peninsula, all seeking to gain power at the expense of other Muslim states. The only winners in this conflict were the Christian kingdoms, which were able to take advantage and increase their own territories through war against the Muslims. The general population supported the overthrow of Murabitun rule in Al-Andalus, but do not seem to have been able to provide a viable alternative. They were still not willing to pick up arms and join jihad armies in any case, so like in the first Tafa period, the Tafa kings had to rely on military assistance from Christian kingdoms, which came at a cost. Following in the footsteps of Yusuf bin Tashfin and Tariq bin Ziyad, the Muwahidun, now led by bin Thumart's successor, Abd al-Mumin, entered Al-Andalus in 1145. Seeking to annex the territory just as the Christian Spanish and Portuguese began to advance on the Muslim Tafas. Within a year, Malaga and Seville were annexed. By 1150, Cordoba and Jai were taken from their Tafa kings. By the time Abd al-Mumin died in 1163, all that remained of Muslim Spain was part of the Muwahidun Empire. Unfortunately for Spain's Muslims, however, all that remained was the southern part of the peninsula. The central plains of the Iberian Peninsula and the eastern coast were firmly under the control of the Christian kingdoms, led by Castile, Portugal, and Aragon. The great achievements and empires built by Spanish Muslims during the Umayyad era were memories that could no longer be replicated. It was clear by now to the Andalusians that the momentum on the peninsula was in favor of the Christians and their main priority would no longer be to build large cities and advance knowledge, but to merely survive in the face of the Christian onslaught. The arrival of the Muwahidun spurred an Islamic revival. Andalusians refocused themselves on their practice of Islam. The emergence of numerous scholars in the peninsula at this time testifies to this. Perhaps the most notable among them was Bin Rushd, known as Averroes in the rest of Europe. Reminiscent of earlier Muslim scholars of the Golden Age, he was a polymath who wrote on subjects ranging from philosophy to physics to psychology. His most lasting contribution was his work in fiqh. Although he was a follower of the Maliki school of fiqh, he authored an encyclopedia of comparative fiqh, entitled The Distinguished Jurist's Primer, Bidayat al-Mujahid, W.A. Nihayat al-Muqtasid. Centuries later, it continues to live on as one of the premier books of fiqh, detailing the differences of opinion of the numerous schools of jurisprudence within Islam. Mystics such as Bin Arabi and Abu al-Hasan ash-Shadhili also emerged during the Muwahidun dynasty. They sought to spiritually inspire Muslims to improve their relationship with God, no doubt partly as a reaction to the bleak political climate in Al-Andalus and North Africa. The Muwahidun largely followed the same pattern as the Murabitun. They both emerged out of the harsh desert environment of Morocco. They both sought to fix what they saw as social ills and political weakness in the region. They both halted the Christian reconquista in Iberia. And they both weakened over time as successive generations lost the drive and willpower that their forefathers cultivated in the deserts of North Africa. The Muwahidun in Al-Andalus declined as family conflicts over power came to the forefront. The late 12th century saw the emergence of civil war in Al-Andalus, coupled with the continued advance of the Christian kingdoms. This time, however, no new Berber religious movement emerged to take their place. Granada. As they had been doing for hundreds of years, the Christians of Spain took advantage of Muslim weakness and division. Pope Innocent III even called for a pan-European crusade to attack the Muwahidun, and in 1212 Spanish, Portuguese, French and English knights assembled near the Sierra Morena mountain range that served as the border between Christian and Muslim control in Iberia. Led by Alfonso VIII of Castile, the crusade made its way through a pass in the mountains to attack the main bulk of the Muwahidun army. At the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, or Al-Ukab as the Muslims called it, the Muslim forces were totally decimated. Over 100,000 casualties for the Muslims meant that the backbone of Muwahidun power in Al-Andalus was broken. The reasons for the loss of the battle are not as important as the results of the disaster. With no ability to resist the Christians, major Muslim cities began to fall one by one. Between 1228 and 1248, Valencia, Seville, Burgos, Majorca, Murcia, Jaén, and others all fell to the Christian onslaught. In 1236, Cordoba fell to the Castilians. The historic capital of early Muslim Spain, with its monumental great mosque, libraries, palaces and gardens could not resist the Castilian army. The mosque was forcibly turned into a Catholic cathedral, with a giant chapel built in the center of the building. The layout of the building, its niche facing Mecca, and the Quranic inscriptions on the walls all remained surrounding the Christian chapel, and ironically testifying to its history as a Muslim house of worship. Later, a 16th century Holy Roman Emperor would decry its conversion to a cathedral, remarking that a building so uniquely beautiful was converted into something ordinary and common. But not all of Al-Andalus was lost after the fall of the Muwahidun. The Emirate of Granada, along the southern coast of Iberia, remained independent of Christian control. There, an Arab dynasty, the Nasrids, took power and managed to hold on for 2 more centuries. They traced their descent back to Banu Khazraj, one of the 2 tribes that welcomed the Prophet in Medina after he was exiled from Mecca in 622. Similarly, the Nasrids welcomed the followers of Muhammad who were exiled from Christian Iberia 600 years after the Hijrah. The Hijrah of Muhammad signaled the beginning of a new Muslim state and a new era of Muslim power in the Arabian Peninsula. The arrival of Muslims in Granada, however, signaled the beginning of the end of Muslim power in the Iberian Peninsula. It was the last remaining Muslim state of Al-Andalus. But the Nasrids of Granada were never truly independent. They only managed to escape annexation by becoming a tributary state to Castile. After the fall of the Muwahidun, the pattern of messy Tafa politics, which pitted Muslim states against one another in a struggle for survival, had reappeared. With such disunity, it was only because of Granada's utility in the eyes of the Castilians that they managed to escape annexation. They promised military aid to the Castilians along with regular tribute payments of gold, which came from the rich mines of Mali in West Africa. This system continuously strengthened the Spanish Christians of the north while reducing the relative power of the Muslim states throughout Al-Andalus and North Africa. In fact, the Nasrids aided some of the Christian conquests of other Andalusian cities in the mid-13th century. Furthermore, outsiders dominated the economy of Granada, as merchants from the rising Italian city-states controlled exports to Europe. Two-way trade with the rest of the Muslim world was almost non-existent. European Christians were the only ones who benefited as Granada's resources slowly dried up. Such a system was obviously not sustainable for long. Even as Islam clung to the southern edge of Iberia at the end of the long and tumultuous decline of Al-Andalus, the Muslim tradition of grandeur and beauty in architecture managed to erect one last monument to Muslim Spain. The Alhambra was a fortification located on a cliff overlooking the city of Granada that had been in use as the city's citadel for hundreds of years before the rise of the Nasrids. The emirs of Granada took to expanding and beautifying the fortress as a palace, and, with the influx of Muslims from the rest of Al-Andalus, the palace perfectly exemplifies the entire artistic history of Muslim Spain. The famous horseshoe arches of the Umayyads and the geometric patterns of the Murabitun and Muwahhidun, along with new Granadan innovations and Spanish Christian architecture, come to create a unique capstone. The gardens, fountains and porticos created an environment reminiscent of the great Muslim palaces in fallen Andalusian cities like Cordoba and Seville. But the Alhambra was more than just a replica of earlier monuments. It also created a new style entirely that was in turn imitated in both Europe and the Muslim world. The Alcazar of Seville, built as a royal palace by the Castilians soon after the Alhambra, directly copied the style of the Nasrid palace, including its gardens, courtyards and arches. Schools and mosques throughout North Africa also drew inspiration from the Alhambra, leading to an architectural legacy that spans centuries. Perhaps the most striking feature of the Alhambra is the motto of the Emirate of Granada, which is plastered all over its walls, Wla Ghalib illallah, meaning "and there is no victor except God." It was a fitting slogan for a state that represented the only vestige of the once great Muslim civilization of Al-Andalus. Even as enemy forces surrounded the vulnerable Granada, the slogan reminded the faithful of their belief in an omnipotent God that cannot be defeated, regardless of the political decline in the peninsula. Perhaps most ironically was the fact that the slogan about God's ultimate victory remained on the walls of the palace, even as the victorious Christian kings occupied it after the fall of the city in 1492. Even as Granada ushered in the final cultural golden age of Al-Andalus, its surrounding political environment weakened it over time, leading to its ultimate demise. The perennial threat to the Nasrids from the Castilians in the north remained a problem. The yearly tribute only strengthened the Christian nation while continuing to weaken Granada. Meanwhile, the Berber Marinid dynasty that ruled over North Africa also emerged as a threat, effectively surrounding Granada with hostile states. Despite the unfavorable surroundings, Granada could have held steady in the face of the Christian advance. It had a very strong defensive position, being shielded by mountain ranges and numerous fortresses that dotted its territory. It was because of this that the Emirate of Granada managed to escape the conquest that befell the rest of Al-Andalus. Yet it was not external invasion that brought about the final end of Muslim Spain, it was internal disagreements. The 1480s was a decade of court intrigue and family conflict, as the Emir of Granada, Abul Hassan, was overthrown and exiled by his son Abu Abdullah Muhammad XII in 1482. Muhammad XII was declared a rebel against God by the scholar class of Granada. And indeed his actions led to the continued decline of political Islam in the Iberian Peninsula. As he rallied armies to fight against his father, the Castilians did not let up their encroachment on Granada. Muslim disunity coupled with advanced artillery in the hands of the Christians led to the quick capture of strategically important fortresses throughout Granadan territory. Just a few decades after the Ottomans used cannon to conquer Constantinople in 1453 and launch Islam into Eastern Europe, Christian armies used the same technology to eliminate it from Western Europe. Furthermore, throughout the history of Al-Andalus, whenever the tide turned in favor of the Christians, North African Muslims would ride to the rescue of their coreligionists. But the late 15th century saw no such rescue. Civil unrest in North Africa meant the rulers were preoccupied with their own problems, and Castilian diplomatic efforts effectively kept them out of Andalusian affairs. The Mamluks of Egypt were called upon by the Granadans for help, but were only able to offer symbolic support. Granada had to find a way to hold off the Christians while dealing with internal civil war on their own. In the end, Such a momentous task proved impossible. Humayad's leadership only added to the woes of Granada. The Castilians captured him in 1486, and during his captivity his father was able to retake the throne. After being held captive for a year, Muhammad was released upon his pledge of allegiance to the Christian state. With arms and soldiers supplied by the Castilians, he managed to establish himself once again as the Emir of Granada, leading to another round of civil war, this time against his uncle. He promised to stay out of the raging war between the Castilians and his uncle, during which most of the Emirate of Granada was conquered by the Christians. By 1490, Granada was the only Muslim-ruled city left in the Iberian Peninsula. At this point, Muhammad XII's alliance with Castile was irrelevant. The famous 12 Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, united the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, paving the way for modern Spain. They had no interest in allowing Granada to continue as an independent Muslim city in the midst of a united Christian Spain, despite their past aid of Muhammad XII. In 1490 and 1491, during the lead-up to the fall of Granada, the Spanish slowly closed in on the lone city. Resources were cut off, refugees flooded the city, and a sense of despair permeated the population. On its own, and with no help coming from the Muslims of North Africa, it was impossible for Granada to hold out against the numerically and technologically superior Spanish. And Muhammad XII knew it. On 25 November 1491, he sent his vizier to negotiate terms of surrender with the Catholic monarchs. On 1 January 1492, the city of Granada was officially handed over to the Spanish. Muhammad XII handed over the keys to the city and the Alhambra to the conquerors early that morning, so that when the residents of the city awoke, they saw that the flags declaring, "And there is no victor except God," that flew over the Alhambra were lowered for the last time as the Castilian flag took their place. To the Christians, it was the joyous fulfillment of a centuries-long struggle to make the Iberian Peninsula Christian. To the Muslims, it was the end of a long and important chapter of Islamic history, one that saw some of the most enlightened, wealthy, and powerful states the world had ever seen. For the vanquished emir, whose political incompetence directly led to the loss of the last bit of a Landless, exile awaited him. Legend has it that on his way out of the city, he looked back at it one last time and began to cry. His mother reproached him, uttering the famous line, "Do not cry like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." The Moriscos. The political history of a Landless ended in 1492. But that was not the end of Spain's Muslim population. There were still between 500,000 and 600,000 Muslims throughout the Iberian Peninsula, with most of them in the former Emirate of Granada. It would not have been possible for the Catholic monarchs to expel such a large portion of Spain's population immediately. Many territories throughout the Iberian Peninsula still relied on their Muslim population to run the local economies. Furthermore, the Spanish did not have the human capital to immediately fill up depopulated cities. Instead, Ferdinand and Isabella initially adopted a tolerant approach to the Muslim minority. The Muslims thus lost some social standing now that the rulers were not of their same religion, but they were given freedom to continue to worship as they pleased under the Spanish monarchy. In 1492, the Spanish government expelled all Jews from their lands. Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II ordered his military and governors to welcome any Jewish refugees from Spain. A sizable Jewish community descended from these Spanish Jews remained in Istanbul until the 20th century. That does not mean that the Christians did not attempt to convert the Muslims to Christianity. Any Muslim that voluntarily chose to convert would be showered with gifts, gold, horses and other valuables. This led to a number of Muslim conversions to Christianity in the years following 1492. To the surprise and disheartenment of the Christians, after collecting their gifts, most of those converts would be found soon afterwards worshipping in mosques and reading the Quran again. With Muslims taking advantage of the incentives offered to them and not sincerely converting to Christianity, the Catholic Church decided to take a more hardline approach. Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, a Catholic archbishop, was appointed in 1499 to speed up the conversion process by harassment of Spain's Muslims, persecution and arbitrary imprisonment of those who chose not to convert. In his own words, he declared, if the infidels couldn't be attracted to the road to salvation, they had to be dragged to it. The result was an expected rebellion by Spain's Muslims against the oppression. The Muslims of Granada, who had endured 8 years of Christian rule but would not endure oppression by the new archbishop, barricaded the narrow streets of Granada and declared their defiance to the efforts of the Cisneros. The revolt gave the Catholic monarchs the excuse they needed to admonish Spain's Muslim community. The Muslim rebels were given two options: the death penalty or conversion to Christianity, which would lead to an official pardon. Pragmatic as ever, Granada's Muslims chose conversion, and a huge wave of baptisms in the predominantly Muslim city commenced. Further rebellions flared in the surrounding countryside, but the more powerful Spaniards eventually put them down within a few years. By 1502, when the rebellions were over, the Christian authorities chose to outlaw Islam throughout Spain. All Muslims were given the option to convert, leave Spain or die. Like the people of Granada, Muslims throughout Spain chose conversion, and soon, the Catholic monarchs could boast that they had converted an entire nation to Christianity within a few years. The reality, however, was that Islam continued to live on in Spain but underground. The supposedly former Muslims, known by the Spanish as Moriscos, professed Christianity to avoid continued persecution, while continuing to live as Muslims in the privacy of their own homes. The Spanish authorities, perhaps suspecting that the Moriscos were not sincere in their conversion to Christianity, instituted numerous laws, as part of the Spanish Inquisition, throughout the early 1500s to cleanse the Moriscos of their Islamic past. Butchering animals according to Islamic law was banned in 1511 by royal decree. Women were banned from covering their faces in 1513. Muslim-style clothing in general was banned in 1523. Furthermore, Moriscos were banned from using bathhouses or closing the doors to their homes on Fridays in an effort to ensure that no one was secretly practicing Islam. Weddings had to be attended by old Christians to ensure that Islamic nuptials were not being practiced. In 1526, even speaking Arabic was outlawed, and Moriscos were forced to speak Castilian at all times, including when at home. These efforts to rid the Moriscos of both their religious and cultural heritage only pushed them further underground and caused them to cling more vigorously to their beliefs. Overall, the Inquisition failed to remove Islam from the hearts of most Moriscos. Instead, it forced them to be more creative about how they worked around the laws. Numerous Muslim scholars wrote fatwas, allowing Muslims to practice their religion in non-traditional ways to avoid detection by authorities. For example, the famous 1502 fatwa by the Mufti of Oran, in present-day Algeria, allowed Muslims to perform ritual cleansing before prayer without water by touching a clean wall, to pray at night instead of 5 times a day, and to eat pork if forced. Religious instruction was restricted to the home, as mosques and schools were closed or converted to Christian churches. But the Arabic language survived behind closed doors, as parents made sure to teach their children Islamic rites and verses of the Quran. Moriscos with Christian names would go to church on Sundays, worship according to Catholic rites, then come home, be referred to by their secret Muslim names, and read the Quran and pray according to the Islamic fashion. The kings of Spain were never fully ignorant of the secret beliefs of the Moriscos. Even 100 years after the conquest of Granada, it was clear to the Spanish monarchy and the Catholic Church that the attempts to convert the Moriscos to Christianity were failing. More and more Moriscos continued to be caught in the middle of Islamic acts by the Inquisition, and the punishments doled out to those caught did nothing to deter others. King Philip III, heavily influenced by hardline Catholic priests, decided in April 1609 to expel all the Moriscos left in Spain. Despite protests from aristocrats throughout Spain, who saw the expulsion the Moriscos as detrimental to the economy, the royal decree took effect later that year. Entire Morisco villages were depopulated, with their citizens being forced to the coast where ships from all over Europe waited to take them to North Africa. The Moriscos were allowed to take whatever they could carry with them, but the Spanish confiscated their property. Children under the age of 4 were exempt from the expulsion and were taken from their families to be raised as Christians. In the south of Spain, rebellions once again arose. The expulsion meant that Moriscos, who had been masquerading as Christians, had nothing to lose by coming out as Muslims and leading one final defense of Islam in the peninsula. For the first time in over 100 years, the Muslim call to prayer rang out in the valleys and hills of Spain. Public communal prayer, unseen since the years after the fall of Granada, was once again convened. The glory days of Islam in Spain were long gone, but the rebels, despite being quickly defeated by the Spanish, managed to revive the memory of Landless and its 800-year history one last time. By 1614, the Moriscos were all gone, and the rebellions all put down. Islam was gone from Spain. There were reports that some Moriscos had managed to somehow stay in the country and continued practicing Islam in secret for centuries. But this truncated Muslim community was nothing more than a shadow of Landless. Despite its contributions to the history of the Iberian Peninsula and the rest of Europe, Islam was absent from Spain. But as Islam fell in this western outpost, it was just starting to be revived in the East, where the Ottomans would reintroduce Islam to Europe and preside over a new golden age.